Well, good morning. Good to see you guys today. As you know by now, we are in a series called Relationship Rehab. Today, we are talking about marriage. And again, I'm really excited about this. This might mean nothing to you. I don't normally title my messages, but I've got a title for all of the ones in this series. And so today is titled, You Can't Make Me Happy. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today when it comes to marriage. And here, think about back to kind of what your expectations were going into marriage if you are married, or maybe what your expectations are if you haven't been married. Maybe it was something like this. Maybe you thought marriage would complete you in some way. Maybe you thought you'll never be lonely again because you always have someone to do something with. Maybe you thought you'll always have something to do, right, because you have someone to do things with. You thought it was going to be fun, like you knew it wasn't going to be fun all the time, but maybe you thought it was always going to be fun most of the time. That it's going to be happily ever after. Maybe you thought you'll have sex twice a day, every day. Maybe, nobody? Come on. The guys are like, I don't know if I can laugh at that. Okay. Maybe you thought that you'll never fight, or if you do fight, you'll like apologize right away. Maybe you thought that it will make you happy. And while some of those things may be true here, might be more of a realistic experience for you. Maybe you found out that marriage didn't complete you. Maybe you found out that you are still lonely at times, maybe a lot of times. Maybe you found out that there are a lot of times that we just sit around and have nothing to do and nothing to talk about. Maybe you realize that it is not always fun. Maybe you even fought on the way to church this morning. Maybe you think, it'd be nice to have sex just twice a week, maybe even twice a month, right? Maybe that would be nice. And maybe here's what you realize, right? That marriage didn't, in fact, make you happy. It didn't do all the things that you thought it was going to do. And of course, what doesn't help us when it comes to marriage is movies and TV shows and even social media, where we all post about when things are going well, and so you have this expectation of what things are supposed to be like. Again, in the movies and shows and everything we watch, like the man and the woman are always so in love. There's always so much passion. They don't really argue, but if they do, they apologize right away. And if someone goes away out of town or whatever, they miss each other a lot, and you're like, sometimes when my spouse leaves, this is kind of nice, right? And so you're like, man, this is not what I thought it would be. And so I think what happens when we kind of see these unrealistic expectations and then we compare them to what we've experienced, we kind of think one of two things. You might think, well, maybe it's because I married the wrong person. Or you think, maybe I didn't marry the wrong person, but it's all their fault. Like, they're the reason why all these things aren't happening the way I want them to happen. Now, what's the problem with that? What's the problem with thinking that way? The problem with thinking that way, that either it's my spouse's fault or I married the wrong person, is we think that because what we think, even if we don't say it, is at some level we think that marriage is all about us and what we can get out of it. Now, this is what our culture tells us, not just about relationships, but in life in general, right? We're told to do whatever makes you happy. Don't let anyone tell you what's wrong. As long as you're not hurting anyone else, whatever that exactly means, you can do whatever you want. Even when it comes to Facebook, like, we can't even be friends with people who disagree with us, right? It's like, unfriend me if you don't like what I'm about to say, right? And so that's the culture we've been brought up in, the culture we're surrounded with, and it's all about us. And so if we're in a marriage or in a relationship that's not making us happy, we automatically conclude that the problem is the other person. And so we bring these expectations into our marriage. We bring these unrealistic expectations into our marriage, these wrong ideas of what marriage is supposed to do. And then we wonder why everything doesn't seem to work and everything is not what we thought it would be, right? And so here's the good news. I just want to say this from the beginning. The good news is that marriage can be and is a great thing with the proper expectations and with the proper actions by the husband and the wife. In fact, it can be one of the greatest things that God has given us. But in order for that to be the case, we need to understand, firstly, why marriage was created in the first place. Because if you don't know why something was created, you're going to have a hard time making it work, especially when it's not working. Now, I don't know anything about cars really, but like if something breaks down in your car, it's not enough to know what broke. You need to know why it broke so it doesn't break again. So like a calibrator, like that's a car thing, right? So if a calibrator breaks, I don't even know if a calibrator can break, but if it breaks, you need to know, you don't just need to know that it broke, you need to know why it broke. Was it because you missed routine maintenance? Was there another issue? If you have an oil leak, like what's causing that? You need to know why, or you can't address the problem. And so this morning, we're going to look at why marriage was created in the first place, and I think that will help us address the issues that we might have in our own. And so I'm going to read Ephesians chapter 5 today. If you have a Bible, you can pull it out. There's a black one somewhere around you, or if you got an app on your phone. You might be thinking, oh, Ephesians chapter 5, that's the typical marriage verse or marriage passage. It is, but here's what we're going to do. I'm just going to read those 11 verses, and then I'm just going to talk about a couple of them this morning. And I think we're going to look at this in a way that you maybe haven't seen this before, or maybe ways that you've had questions about it. So we're going to read this. I'm just going to read this straight through, and I'm going to talk about a few of these verses. And here's what we're going to find, that although this passage is about marriage, it's actually much more about Jesus and the church. And Paul, who writes Ephesians, is using marriage to show us Jesus' relationship with the church. It's not that we can't take things about how we should be married from it, but that's actually not the primary thing that Paul is talking about in this passage. So I'm just going to read it straight through and just talk about a couple of the verses this morning. Here's what he says, starting in verse 22. It says, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of the body. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives are to submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, to make her holy, cleansing her with the washing of water by the word. He did this, Jesus did this, to present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or anything like that, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands are to love their wives as their own bodies. Who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hates his own flesh, but provides and cares for it, just as Christ does for the church. Since we are members of his body, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and will be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This mystery is profound, but I am talking about Christ and the church. To sum up, each one of you is to love his wife as himself, and the wife is to respect his husband." So that's the whole passage. I want to just focus on the last couple of verses here this morning. I'm going to go ahead and say, if you can stick with me, so I'm going to get a little technical, probably a little technical, more technical than we normally do. And so I think what's going to happen is I'm going to get a little confusing, but then it's going to make sense, okay? So if you get confused, just stick with me. I promise it's going to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, well, then you're just going to leave confused, but that's not the plan this morning. And so again, I want to read verse 31 and 32. Here's what Paul says. He says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This mystery is profound, but I'm talking about Christ and the church." And so here's what Paul is talking about. Again, this whole point is he's talking about Christ's relationships for the church, and he talks about it being a mystery. Now, mystery in Greek, the Greek word that he uses here, was written, New Testament was originally written in Greek, is mysterion, which can mean a variety of things, but one of the things that mysterion means is secret. So what Paul is saying here is that it's a secret as to how marriage reflects Christ and the church. But when he says it's a secret, he doesn't mean that it's a secret that only a few people can know about, like only if you're smart enough or enlightened enough, or it's like only for a select few. That's not what he means by a secret. What he means is it was a secret that God has now revealed to us with the coming of Jesus. In other words, the hidden plan of God's fulfillment of salvation was made possible in Jesus. And so Paul uses this word mysterion to talk about it. He also uses this word in other parts of the New Testament to talk about God's saving purposes in the gospel. So in other words, this secret of marriage has to do with the message of Jesus. That's what the secret is about. Meaning that before Jesus came, in the Old Testament times, the creation, before Jesus came, it was a mystery, or it was a secret as to how marriage reflected God's plan for salvation, because people hadn't seen Jesus, the Messiah hadn't come. So if you had told them, hey, your marriage is going to reflect God's plan for salvation, it's not going to make a lot of sense because Jesus hadn't come yet, so they would have been a little confused. But now that Jesus has come, we now see why marriage was created. All the way back in the beginning, marriage was created to be a continual reminder of what God would do and then what God did do for us in Jesus. That's why marriage was created. One of the main reasons why marriage was created. That is why in Ephesians 5 that we read this morning, he applies mysterion, this really rich term, to marriage. In fact, verse 31 that we read was a quote from Genesis 2, from the first marriage between Adam and Eve, where he says, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." So even from the beginning, that was God's design. That verse 31 is a reference to Genesis 2. So that's why Paul writes that it is a mystery. Now, how does marriage actually reveal God's plan for salvation? That's the question. How does that actually happen? Or what is the secret to marriage? So we know that marriage reflects God's saving plan, but what is the secret to having a good and healthy marriage, right? Here's what he says, verse 32. You stick with me. He says this, I'm talking about Christ and the church. So Christ and the church is part of the secret when it comes to marriage. And when he says that, he's referencing what he said in verse 25. And here's what he says in verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. So long story short, here it is. The secret to marriage is that husbands should do for their wives just what Jesus did for us when he brought us into a relationship with himself. In other words, the secret of marriage is about how we should operate in marriage, and it's found in what Jesus did. And so the question again is, what did Jesus do? Jesus gave himself up for us. This is the gospel. This is the good news of Jesus, that he came, lived the perfect life that we couldn't live, died the death that we deserve, that whoever trusts and repents and believes in Jesus now has a relationship with God, right? And this is what happens. So this is the good news, that even though Jesus was equal to God, even though Jesus was God, here's what he did. Philippians 2, it'll be on the screen. Here's what Jesus did. It says, Jesus, who existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of humanity, and when he had come as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even to death on a cross. So why did Jesus do this? Why did Jesus come? He came so that ultimately we could take on his nature, right? He gave up his glory, he gave up his power, he gave up his righteousness to become a servant for us. In other words, he put away his own interests and looked to our needs. So Jesus' sacrifice made it possible for us to be brought into a relationship with him. He loved and served us, and that is our example. And this, according to Paul, what we're reading here, is the key to not only understanding marriage, but to living it. This is why Paul is able to tie this original statement of marriage back to Genesis 2 to Jesus and the church, because we are supposed to operate in our marriages the way Jesus operated towards us. G.W. Knight puts it this way. He says this, Paul saw that when God designed the original marriage, he already had Christ and the church in mind. This is one of the great purposes in marriage, to picture the relationship between Christ and his redeemed people forever, which means that how we treat our spouses is supposed to mimic how Jesus treated us. He gave himself up for us, which again, in a healthy relationship, this means both spouses are doing this, not just one. However, this does not mean that marriage is supposed to be inherently oppressive. Like if you're listening to this, you could be like, are you saying that that means I need to do whatever my spouse wants me to do at all the time? I can't do anything that I want to do. I can't enjoy anything. In other words, are you saying that I should be my spouse's butler, if you would, for a lack of better term? That is not what we're saying, and in fact, that is not how the relationship between God the Father and God the Son operates. So Philippians 2 that we just read, we saw that Jesus submitted to the Father, but the question is, what did God the Father do in return, right? Remember that Jesus did not account equality with God as something to be exploited, but his greatness was revealed in his humility and willingness to become the Father's servant. So Jesus gave himself up on the cross. And the question is Jesus just God's butler, right? Or what did God do in response to that? Here's how Philippians continues. It says this, for this reason, so because Jesus came and gave his life and gave up of himself for us, for this reason, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name. So at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow in heaven and on earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And this is absolutely amazing, because what we're seeing is that God, although he's one being, he's also three distinct beings. He's loving and serving and sacrificing for himself. This isn't a oppressive, you do what I say. This is I'm going to serve you, you're going to serve me, and we're going to mutually fulfill each other. That is the picture that he is giving us about marriage. Robert Leatham puts it this way. He says, this shows what God is like. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit do not manipulate each other for their own ends. There is no conquest of unity by diversity or diversity by unity. The three are one and the one is three. That's what he's talking about when Paul says the two become one flesh. We're distinct, but we're also one in some mysterious ways. Okay, so let's keep going real quickly. In Ephesians 5 that we read, Paul shows us that even on earth, though, so we get that Jesus and God are kind of loving and serving each other, but even when Jesus was on earth, he did not use his power to oppress. He did not come and say, hey, look how amazing I am. He didn't do anything like that. Instead, he came to sacrifice and serve and to bring us into union with him. And here's what Tim Keller says. I know I'm quoting a lot of people this morning. I've only been married for 7 years, so I'm going to talk to people who know a little bit more about this thing than I do. Here's what Tim Keller says about this. He says, and this takes us, this idea of what God is doing and how he's loving and serving himself, takes us beyond the philosophical to the personal and practical. If God had the gospel of Jesus' salvation in mind when he established marriage, then marriage only works to the degree that approximates the pattern of God's self-giving love in Christ. It only works to the degree that we are attempting to emulate that in our own marriages. And so here's what this means for us this morning, because you may be sitting here and be like, okay, this sounds interesting. Okay, God loved and served. I guess I'm supposed to love and serve. So what does that actually mean for me, and where do I even start? Right, here's what I think we should do. I think here's what Paul is telling us to do when it comes to marriages, and that's this. That we should do for our spouse what God did for you in Jesus, and the rest will follow. So when it comes to how you should operate in your marriage, you should do for your spouse what God did for you in Jesus, and the rest will follow. So in other words, don't look to your spouse to make you happy. Again, that's not your spouse's job, but look to yourself to bring joy to your spouse. And this is a secret that Paul is talking about, that the gospel of Jesus and marriage explain one another. And it also shows us that when God invented marriage in the beginning, like we're talking about, he already had the saving work in Jesus in mind, which is absolutely fascinating, because if you remember when the first marriage had occurred, the world had not been cursed and fallen yet. Sin had not entered the world, and yet God already had in mind what he was going to do when sin would enter the world, and that is part of what marriage is supposed to be a picture of, which means that, again, marriage is not about denying all your own interests for the good of your family. This is kind of like the traditional way you look at marriage, right? The traditional way you looked at marriage was like, okay, the husband goes to work all day and he tries to provide for his family, and the wife kind of raises the kids and she tries to do her part, and it's just about the husband and wife doing whatever is best for the family, which is good to some degree, but that misses the mark. Okay, so this traditional idea of marriage just misses the mark a little bit, because it's not just about you doing other things and never being fulfilled yourself, so that misses it. But also the contemporary view of marriage also misses the mark, because the contemporary view of marriage is just like our society's view on life in general, that it's all about pursuing your own interest and the fulfillment of yourself. So again, marriage is not about not feeling fulfilled at all, not doing anything, and it's also not about just living for it yourself. Both of those ideas miss the mark. Again, Tim Keller says this way, here's what marriage is supposed to be. The Christian teaching on marriage does not offer a choice between fulfillment and sacrifice. So fulfillment in terms of it's all about me, and sacrifice in terms of like I can't do anything enjoyable in my life. That's not what Christian marriage offers the choice between. Instead, but rather, here's what marriage is supposed to look like: mutual fulfillment through mutual sacrifice. Jesus gave himself up. He died to himself to save us and make us his, and now we give ourselves up for one another. This goes back to what we talked about last week when we looked at dating, that the goal of any relationship is not your happiness, but your holiness. The goal for any relationship, again, talking about romantic relationships today, we're talking about marriage, is not your happiness, but your holiness. And my guess is, as we said last week, as you pursue your holiness, how do we pursue holiness? What even is holiness? Long story short, holiness is pretty much becoming more like Jesus, right? And so how do we become more like Jesus? We do what Jesus did. And what did Jesus do? He loved and he sacrificed and served us. And so if you have two people in a marriage who are loving and sacrificing and serving one another, you might just find joy and happiness in your marriage as well. But you will miss that if both of your individual goals are for your own happiness. Instead, if you are loving and serving each other, which is why a strong marriage takes both parties to doing this, you will actually find joy and happiness in your marriage that you would not find if you set out to do everything on your own, if you thought marriage was all about what you wanted and what you could get. And this is how marriage reflects what Jesus did for us. This is why marriage was created, which is so important to understand if we want strong and healthy marriages, right? That Jesus loved and sacrificed and served us. And this is what we must do for our spouse. This is what you must do for your spouse if you want a great marriage. Because we all know this, great marriages don't just happen. It takes work. It takes intentionality. And like anything worth having in life, it can be hard. But when we do this, it can be more fulfilling than anything else that we could set out to do, which again, what Paul is saying in these verses that we read is this, that you should do for your spouse what God did for you in Jesus, and the rest will follow. And so here's what I want to do as I kind of get towards the end here. I want to make this practical because I think sometimes we kind of see these things, we're like, okay, this makes sense, and then we kind of go home and don't do anything about it. So if you're like, okay, that makes sense, I should do for my spouse what God did for me in Jesus, I want us to make this really practical and give us a way to actually do this. So if you're married, here's what we're going to do. I reached out to Dr. Kim, who runs Awesome Marriage, the date boxes that we give away. He's been married and he's been a marriage counselor for over 40 years, so this guy knows what he's talking about. And I said, okay, here's what we're talking about this week. Here's kind of the main point. Can you give me some practical things that husbands can do to serve their wife, like Jesus served us, and some practical things that wives can do to serve their husbands? And so some of these are mine, but most of them are his. And so if I say anything that's like a little risky, just assume that he said it, and you can email him. But here's what I want to do. I've got 20 things for men to do for their wives and for wives to do for their husbands. You don't need to write these down. We have a list. We're going to hand them out to you as you leave. And let me just challenge you this way if you're married. Do these things over the next month. Some of these things you're supposed to try to do every day. Some of these things are one-time things. If you do this over the next 30 days, I guarantee you your marriage will look a little bit different than it does today. And so here's the list. I'm going to go pretty quickly. It's going to be on the screen. You don't need to write it down. We're going to hand it out as you leave. We're talking about do for your spouse what God did for you in Jesus, and the rest will follow. So men, we'll go with you first. Here are some things that you can do for your spouse to serve them. Here we go. I'll explain some of these, but I'll try to go quickly through most of them. They're not in any particular order either. Here's the first one. Stop looking at porn and lusting after other women. If you are married, your standard of beauty is your spouse. Now, I'm not naive. If you are addicted to pornography, yes, there's a chance that you could pray and then leave today and never be addicted again. But what we want to do, again, if we're going to try to pursue this over the next month, I think the first thing to do is just to be honest about your struggle and your addiction, and let's do some things that will help you. There's things like Covenant Eyes that I have on my software that tracks every site I go to and sends a report to a friend every single week. There's different softwares that you can do, but if you want to love and serve your wife, it starts with chasing her beauty and not lusting after other women. So that's one thing you can do, stop looking at porn and lusting after other women. Here's another thing, never talk negatively about your wife to your friends. It's a difference if you're struggling and you have a friend that you want to talk to, hey, this is going on. But just in general, you should not talk negatively about your spouse. That does not build her up. It does not serve her. 3, allow your wife to have a day or night out with her friends once a month and watch the kids. I think sometimes husbands forget like that their kids are also their kids. And so that you can watch them if you did not know. And so let me just encourage you, once a month, say you can have the day off, you can have Saturday, you have the night, you go out with your friends and I will watch the kids. When she is talking, really listen, face her, make eye contact, respond appropriately so that she knows you are listening. Some people are already laughing, so maybe you should do that. Number 5, take care of your appearance. If you're going on a date, like wash your hair, take a shower, put on a button-up. I don't know, actually look nice for your spouse. 6, ask her what is important to her in the sexual relationship, then follow through. This isn't about doing something that makes you uncomfortable, but part of having a great relationship and a great marriage is having a good sex life, and you're not going to have a good sex life if you don't talk about it. Number 7, delete old girlfriends from social media. There's really no reason to have them on there. Number 8, initiate doing a Bible reading plan for her. Pray with her daily. Tell her that the divorce word is permanently off the table in your marriage. You're not even going to joke about it. And number 11, initiate non-sexual touching with no hidden agenda. Set aside uninterrupted time with her every day. Tell her about your day. Bring her a surprise gift for no reason but to show her you were thinking about her. Send her an I'm thinking about you text every day. Plan a surprise date just for the two of you. Be the first to say, I'm sorry. Ask her to give you one thing that she thinks would make your marriage better, and then do it. Tell her every day how beautiful she is. If you are sincere, she will never tire of hearing you say that. And then lastly, pray that your sexual desire would be for your wife only. Again, just try to do these things to the best of your ability over the next 30 days. Let me just ask real quick, women, do any of these things on those lists sound nice to you? There we go. Okay. So just try to do those things. Women, don't get too excited because now it's your turn. Here we go. Again, we're talking about do for your spouse what God did for you in Jesus. So just trying to practically love your spouse. Here a list that you could make. Again, I didn't come up with this. So number one, never talk negatively about your husband to your friends. So the same things apply. If we're going to love and serve our spouses, there's no reason for us to bash them around our friends. Two, don't talk about how other men are cute or attractive. It's not a wise practice, even if your husband doesn't really care. I know this is different. Like, guys kind of know that they're not supposed to talk about the attractiveness of women. And I know that, generally speaking, it's different. It's not like when a woman says, hey, that guy's attractive, that she's trying to say she wants to sleep with him. I get that. But I'll just tell you this. I know a lot of husbands will say, oh, you can talk about that actor, but it doesn't really bother me. I'm not too man enough to admit it, but this is one of the things that Christina and I have always done. I have never heard her go out of her way to say that some other man was attractive, and I cannot tell you how much that means to me. Your husband may not tell you this, but if you want to build your husband up, talking about how attractive other men are, even if you're kind of just joking, it just doesn't help. And so if you want a practical thing, I'll just tell you from experience, it means a lot to me. It may mean a lot to your husband. Number three, initiate sex with your husband once a month or more. So, you be the one to initiate. I just saw someone in the back do a little fist bump, and so I'm just saying. Number four, ask him what he wants in this sexual relationship. You can absolutely say no, but open up the dialogue. Again, part of what it means to have a great relationship, a great marriage, is to have great sex, and you will not have great sex if you do not talk about it. Number five, delete old boyfriends from social media. And there's no point in having it. Give him a full frontal hug every day. Send him a selfie of you every day. Greet him with a kiss every morning and night. Make an I love you video and send it to him. Ask him to take a shower with you. Give him a no strings attached back rub. Arrange for the kids to spend the night out and plan a surprise romantic evening at home. Be the first to say I'm sorry. Tell him you love him without using words. Ask him how you can help him today. Do an activity with him that he loves to do. Cook or bring in one of his favorite meals. Watch an action or superhero movie or a sports game or whatever, something that he wants to watch with him and act like you're enjoying it. Don't act like you enjoy it too much because he might ask you to do it again, but 19, pray for him in his role as the leader of your family every day and tell him 3 things you admire about him. Guys, anything on that list sound good to you other than number 10? Here's the thing, right? Again, these are generalizations. Do them to the best that you can, but what we're talking about this morning is doing for our spouses what God did for you in Jesus, and the rest would follow. It's not about a checklist. It's not about doing these things or not doing these things. It's just about practically pursuing and loving our spouses. And I just guarantee you, if you have a husband and a wife who do what we just talked about at the end of 30 days are loving and serving one another, I guarantee your marriage will look at least a little bit different than it does today, even if you have a great marriage. And again, this is the mystery of what Christ did for us, and this is what the mystery of what Christ did for the church. And it is shown and it is revealed in a healthy and strong marriage, where we die to ourselves and we serve our spouse. And so we can pray and we can ask God to give us strength to do these things, to practically die to ourselves, to serve our spouse, to do for our spouse what Jesus did for us. And we can also pray for forgiveness when we blow it. Again, you're going to mess up. I'm going to mess up. That's why Jesus came to give us grace, where we can give our spouses grace, but at the same time, love and serve our spouses together. Again, do for your spouse what God did for you in Jesus, and the rest will follow. That is what it takes, and that is what it looks like to have a great marriage. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for who you are. God, thank you for sending Jesus to be, not just to save us in ways that we don't deserve, and to do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves, but to be an example of what marriage is supposed to look like. That if we die to ourselves and serve our spouses, and our spouses are dying to themselves and loving and serving us, we will find mutual fulfillment and mutual satisfaction in ways that we've never experienced before. God, marriage is a great gift that you have given us, but it is not the ultimate thing. It is not designed to make us happy. It is not designed to fulfill us. That is why you came, and that is who you are, that as we pursue you, we experience more fulfillment and more satisfaction, even if it's not fully fulfilling because we aren't in your kingdom yet. And God, I just pray this morning for those that are married that may be struggling, or those that are married that have great marriages, that you would remind us that it is not about us, that you would convict us to love and serve our spouses with no intent of getting anything in return, But if we are both, as husband and wife, are loving and serving one another, we're going to experience more fulfilling marriages, but we're also going to be a picture of what you have done for us. That means we love and serve one another. We're a picture to our friends who may not know you, a picture to our coworkers, a picture to other people of who you are and your nature and how you've loved and served us. And so, God, we are so grateful for your gift. We are so undeserving. And I just pray that you would do a great work in the marriages of New City and those that are here, and that you would reveal the goodness that marriage can be. And for those that are in a difficult spot, that you would give those the humility and the willingness to seek and ask for help when it's needed. God, thank you for your son. We love you so much. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.